Hey, everybody. Peter Maravelis here, hoping this finds you all safe and well. On behalf of City Lights booksellers and publishers and the City Lights Foundation, I'd like to welcome you to City Lights Live, our virtual reading series that follows in the footsteps of our in-store calendar during the time of the pandemic. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral grounds of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area, from where we continue to celebrate the works of authors we know and love with readings, discussions, and forums. Moving into the spring of 2022 and hopefully towards a COVID-free era. So today we are delighted and honored to have with us JJ Bola, celebrating the publication of his new novel titled The Selfless Act of Breathing. It is published by Simon & Schuster. JJ Bola is a writer, poet, novelist, playwright, and educator. He is an ambassador to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, whose work has been concerned with protecting and assisting refugees around the world. Mr. Bola is the author of 3 poetry collections. He's also the author of a novel and a book of nonfiction. So he has actually, one of his kind of honors is he has been with Spread the Word's Flight Associates, and he's also a Kit DeWall Scholar for the Birkbeck University Master's Program in Creative Writing. Mr. Bola has made appearances around the world. He's read from his work, performing, also giving workshops, mentoring writers. Currently, he resides in London. He's beaming there today for us. So really very, very, very honored to have him with us. So before we begin, I want to remind you that we're going to be posting links in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard with which you may purchase copies of The Selfless Act of Breathing. We're also going to be hosting a Q&A towards the end of the talk. So if you have any questions, comments, praise, please do post them in that chat function. So please join us now in giving a very warm welcome to JJ Bola. Welcome to City Lights Live.
Thank you for having me, Peter. Thank you so much.
So firstly, I want to congratulate you on the new book. I mean, it's really quite fantastic in ever so many ways. And I'm not just saying that because City Lights makes a cameo appearance in the story, but seriously, I mean, the book addresses some very deep issues, and I'm looking forward to exploring some of them with you here today. So I was hoping if we could begin with you reading an excerpt from the book, but if you could also at first kind of create some context for us, offer us a little bit of background for Michael Kabongo.
So yeah, thank you. Also, thank you for the introduction and just for having me today. And welcome to everyone who's joined us. If you have a cup of tea and some biscuits, like, well done to you. If you don't, I suggest that you get that and get yourself a little bit comfortable. I have mine here. So the book, The Selfless Act of Breathing, follows the story of a young man named Michael Kabongo, who is from London. He lives in London, he grew up in London, but his family is originally from Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo. And he is at a point in his life where he's experiencing a crisis of self, really, and which leads him to make the decision to quit his job, take his life savings and fly to America, upon which he will decide at the end of this journey to whether or not to end his life. And so that's what he's currently struggling with. And so I'll read a little kind of passage, which is literally how the book opens. And the book itself explores various themes from mental health to masculinity to love to joy and heartbreak. And we'll get into speaking about that also a little bit later on. But yeah. So The Selfless Act of Breathing, Part 1, Memento Mori. Chapter 1, London Heathrow Airport, Terminal 2, 9 a.m. I quit my job. I'm taking my life savings, $9,021, and when it runs out, I'm going to kill myself. The flight is in 1 hour. He left with more than enough time to get there, yet somehow it was lost. Hesitation, fear, anxiety. Bodies pass him in every direction. He stands still, looks up to the board to find the check-in. He sees a young blonde-haired mother carrying her child. Behind them is a tall man, eyes closed, earphones in, hair tied in locks, carrying a backpack and a guitar, wearing harem pants, looking as though he is going on an adventure to find himself. Two pilots and a quartet of flight attendants glide through in coordinated steps, emanating a glow as if the path beneath them is lit up, followed by two lovers with matching stonewashed jeans delicately in each other's arms. He rushes over to the queue, 9:15 a.m. He reaches the front and passes his burgundy red passport to the lady at the counter. This passport, a thing hoped for, a blessing, a prayer, can save a life, can make a life, can take a life too. This passport split between red and blue, between land and sea, between hope and despair. This passport, without it, I have no place to call. Good morning, sir, she says, and flashes her per-hour smile. He mumbles a greeting, tapping his fingers on the desk. What is your destination, sir? San Francisco. She types into the keyboard with a blank expression. She calls her colleague, who has already checked in 3 customers in this time. They both stare at the screen diligently. What's going on, he says, with palpable frustration. I'm sorry, sir, the other colleague says, her heavily made up face, contoured nose, lips painted, a burgundy wine distracting him. We can't seem to find your booking. That's wrong. I booked it myself. My name is definitely there. Michael Kabongo. I can't miss this flight. Look again, he calls out, raising his voice and flailing his arms, pointing, drawing attention. They look up at him, ignoring his outbursts, then at each other. I do apologize, sir. You're at the wrong check-in. You need to go to... His heart thuds as her voice fades out. He watches the direction she points him. He snatches his passport back. 9:20 a.m. His lungs tighten and breath shortens as he runs through the crowd. He feels too hot for this brisk autumn morning. His skin boils under his coat. His scarf suffocates him. He starts to sweat. He is at the back of the long S-shaped queue. 9:22 a.m. He bobs up and down on his toes with the same kind of urgency as a child bursting to pee. He mumbles under his breath, prompting others to look at him with suspicion. Someone at the front of the queue is loud, meandering, making conversation, being friendly, and wasting time. I'll stop there. And then the rest goes into it. Yeah.
Right on, right on. Thank you so much. This novel really strikes me as a kind of a parable of our time. I mean, it's about escape. It's about the attempt to transcend borders, but not just physical borders, but also kind of, interior borders. Michael is juggling a great many things in his heart and in his mind, and he's really compelled to travel because of a deep existentialist dis-ease. And I think, the basic human rights of equity, fairness, and respect are kind of juxtaposed against severe injustice. And the dissonance that divide generates is traumatizing. So I was hoping, could you speak of the importance and significance of trauma in the book, and also how it relates to border crossing?
So Michael, at the point he is in his life, it's quite interesting because he's not someone who on the surface you would read as having a necessarily traumatic life. He has gone to university, he's well educated, he's got a career, profession, he's got, kind of all the things that we essentially look for in life in terms of like a love or companionship or those kind of interests, family, social engagements, etc. But there's a lot of internal conflict within him. And I think his position as a teacher also kind of serves a lot of internal conflict too, and brings up a lot in terms of his own unresolved issues through his childhood. So for any of those of us who have worked in education or worked with young people, we sit at a really kind of fine line between telling them the harsh reality of adulthood and what the real world, quote unquote, has to offer us, but also keeping hope in them alive and saying, you can do something, you can make something of your lives, of yourselves, of the world, you can change the world and so forth, but also believing in that. And I think for him, he finds as he goes along that kind of hope dwindling, and that makes him deeply reflect on his own experience and his own issues, having grown up in London, but come from Congo, left a conflict-ridden country, had issues with his parents and so forth, with his family relations. And I think what essentially I was trying to explore with Michael was how trauma, no matter how long ago it has left us, still makes a significant influence in terms of like the decisions that we make in our everyday lives, and just how, you know, that's influenced by our identities, and particularly like our nationalities and our ethnicities as well. And I think about how those borders of nations, but also those borders of identities, actually kind of significantly influence the way that we see ourselves. So Michael struggles to come to terms with his emotions, and I think that's a reflection of the borders that he has on himself, or that's placed on him as a result of his manhood or masculinity. And so it was those kind of lines that I was trying to explore with him as a character.
Yeah. A leitmotif appears throughout the book, and it's how the measure of a man is how much money he has in the bank. And it also operates as the kind of continuation of that memento mori that you mentioned at the very beginning, kind of reminding us that a protagonist's time is kind of running out. Would you talk about the cost extracted by a worldview that's obsessed with the measure of all things without respect or empathy to the value found in our humanity?
So the theme of, and I'm so glad you brought up, I said this previously when we were chatting, but the theme of Michael and his life savings. So essentially his life savings firstly represent the sum of his life. The fact that you call it life savings almost is an indicator of that this is what your life has come up to. And so if you see for him, like $9,000, it's really interesting because everyone looks at it from a different perspective. I've had people who respond and say, that's his life savings? That's nothing. And I've had people say, oh my gosh, that's a lot of money. How does he have so much money as a teacher? You know, so everyone's coming at it from a different perspective. And the fact that the money that he has is slowly dwindling away, and also reflects how hopeful in many ways he feels about his own life and his own situation. And sometimes he's able to forget about how much money he doesn't have, but then other times he's harshly reminded. And I think a lot of the times that's a reflection of, you know, essentially the capitalist nature of society, that so often we are living through whatever, the way that we experience life essentially is often impacted by what we kind of can financially afford to experience. And, you know, so we speak about how whether we're able to have empathy for someone, whether we're able to connect with people, whether we're able to find some kind of community, right? And particularly for people who are struggling and searching for that, for people who might feel isolated, so much of that is influenced by what we can financially afford. And so for him, even being able to travel shows that he has a certain amount of financial privilege, but not enough to actually fully escape, you know, the trappings of his everyday life. And so it's almost like a double-edged sword.
Yeah, very much. Hey, I want to remind a lot of you in the audience, you know, some of you are latecomers. We've posted links in the chat function with which you may purchase copies of the Selfless Act of Breathing. And also a reminder that, you know, if you have any questions, comments, praise, please do post them in that chat function, and we'll be, you know, looking at them towards the end. So I would love to hear some more of your beautiful prose. Would you read us one more piece?
Yeah, absolutely. So I wonder if as so much of it, I mean, it's set in so much of it is set in London, half of it is set in London, the other half throughout America. I wonder, for those of you who are more familiar with the American parts, kind of are more curious to hear about the London parts, because often here, when I do events here, they're more curious to hear about the American parts. So I don't know, it's just a thought, but I'll read a London part.
Let's see, somebody, let's see. Oh, it was a question about the title. So I'd love to hear about London, but that's just me.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, I'll read, this is chapter 14. So yeah, Peck River Estate, London, 8:17 p.m. I walk the dimly lit streets filled with parked cars and trees lurking. Home. It was odd how over the years it felt less and less like home, yet it was all the home I had ever known. I looked up at this tall building, a tower block in a dull grey color breaking the sky. defiant against this backdrop of flashing city lights, opulence, and monuments in the distance. So far in the distance, it was another world. We had lived and seen it all here. No electricity, a room full of candles, no heat, wear your coat inside, a floor with no carpet, the rusted wooden floorboard cutting into our feet. We had seen it all here, drug dealers smoking and snorting at the end of the steps, police raids at 4 a.m., barking dogs and chases, broken windows, cold air breaking in, burglary and theft. Not safe to walk through past a certain time unless you knew somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody, someone who jumped from the 4th floor, trying to take their own life, but only managing to break their legs. We watched him, laid there, body flat, knees inverted like a bird, his only wish to fly away from here, and fires blazing, touching the sky, a furious lover scorned. But we had also seen bread, sugar, milk shared and borrowed, sitting and eating with strangers until they too became family. Children walking to school together every day until they too became family. Conversations at the bottom of the block, exchanging life stories in the 15-second lift ride up, and sometimes longer if you were stuck. We had also seen parties, music so loud the party came to your living room, and leftover food being brought around. Christmas, where no one was left alone. Halloween and trick or treat so intense, we carried it on. We carried it on for days after. This was the place we had all known, the only place we called home. I reached the front door of the building and came in as someone was leaving. "You all right?" we said to each other simultaneously. I didn't know his name, but recognized him. I knew he lived floors above us, at the steps of the ground floor, where some young guys, tracksuits and hoods up, a puff of smoke lingering above them like a cloud at the peak of a mountain, plant smell wafting through the air. I looked at each one of them and they looked back at me. Not one of us breaking the stare. This act of defiance, this battle we found each other fighting, angry at everything outside of us and everything, including ourselves.
Wow.
Thank you.
Thank you. I was very curious. So you've worked with younger writers who are attempting to articulate their stories, who are working towards coping with past traumas, and having lived it yourself, would you describe the road towards integrating experiences? I mean, how does that begin, and what was your road like?
So, firstly, my road was I would say serendipitous. It was quite random, completely unintentional. I had no idea that I would become a writer. I had no idea that I could become a writer. Really, when I started writing, or what was the early forms of it, was when I was at university, and I should have been paying more attention and taking better notes and so forth. But I found myself constantly distracted, constantly trying to make sense of, the feelings that was going on inside. I studied psychology, and we all know like the common saying that, you study psychology to help others, but you study psychology to help yourself. And so oftentimes I was there, sat in class thinking, what is going on in my head? What am I feeling? And so forth, but not really knowing when to go for help. And so I just started writing things down, and eventually that turned into poetry, and then that turned into storytelling and so forth. And I started to go to open mics. I had no idea what open mics were. One of my friends forced me, like literally forced me. And I thank him to this day forever, because it changed my life. And then one thing that happened was that when I wrote, I thought the poems were just something that I was experiencing. But actually, so many other people came to me and we spoke, and they said that they were going through the same thing and so forth in terms of whatever subject I was writing about. And I found that fascinating. And I think for me, that kind of like speaks to James Baldwin, one of James Baldwin's quotes, where he says, you think you're the only person in the world going through something, and then you read, and then you feel less alone. You realize that, wait, someone in this book has written exactly how I'm feeling. I thought it was just me. And so that's the kind of experience that I had so many times where I read and I was like, oh my gosh, how did they just capture exactly how I'm feeling? And so that just snowballed, really. I just loved it. Like, I had no idea or intention really of being published. I just loved writing, and I loved sharing. And then it all just kind of like went from there. And I think more specifically, when I started to refine my craft and really kind of put into practice in terms of what I'm doing with intention, the work that I do with young people, that I've done with young people, is really about empowerment. It's about us as human beings, wherever you're from, whatever your background is, or whatever you identify as, having the language to be able to narrate our own lives. And so for so many of us, like, we are told what our lives are, who we are, what we make of ourselves, but we don't really narrate our own lives for us. And I think that narration of our own lives is a way to reclaim our power, to reclaim our existence, that I am here for the reason that I choose to be here, that I have this agency, that my life, we often see our lives as like, well, what you're supposed to have been, right? Like what you could have been. For me, I wanted to be a professional basketball player. I wanted to play in the NBA. That didn't happen, right? And so for so long, I saw my life as a failure of that. And anything that wasn't that was almost like I was never good enough. But actually, that kind of shifting of the narrative is us actually taking power of our own lives, you know, that you were never meant to do anything. You were simply just meant to be and experience life and share and connect and so forth. And so essentially, that's what I try to do, is like give some of that power back to ourselves, help us to narrate our own lives, whether that's through poetry. Obviously, I use poetry and writing as like my main means, but really it's like using any creative tool to be able to explain and speak to yourself in the way that you understand.
Yeah, I'm always moved by how writing can save lives.
Mm.
You know, it never gets lost on me. And not just hosting people, but working with school groups and what have you, younger kids. It's really amazing. I want to talk a little bit about your work with the UN, because
Mhm.
you're engaged in literary diplomacy. You also had a very cool moment, I think, with Kate Blanchett, where you were like having an interview, and it was some
Yeah,
interesting stuff there. I mean, you're kind of getting out there and doing some good work. Could you talk a little bit about that?
yeah. So that was really interesting. That was also again something that was very unexpected. I wrote a poem called Refuge. I think this was back in 2013 or 2014, which is essentially about kind of mine and my family's refugee experience here in the UK. And that was born out of a frustration of people not really understanding what it means to be a refugee, the reality of being a refugee, and that refugees and children of refugees are all around us, like they are us. They, you know, they teach your kids, um, they give you healthcare, they do all kind of things all around. And so that was really what that was born out of. And then the UNHCR wanting to kind of connect with more everyday experience, they reached out to me, and through them, you know, we did different campaigns, raising awareness about refugee issues, trying to highlight specific causes, not just in Congo, but in different parts of the world. You know, not a lot of people know, but there's approximately 17 million, 17 million refugees all around the world. That's the population of the United Kingdom, for example. And it's just bewildering that, you know, even till like this, at this point in time where, you know, we're all obviously aware of what's going on between, like in Ukraine, for example, and how people's lives have unfortunately like been suddenly transformed, that being a refugee could happen to any of us, you know, and it could be political, it could be social political, it could be environmental. We just don't know. And so again, like that, for me, I'm a strong advocate of kind of living in a world without borders. Because it just, in this day and age, in 2022, that borders still exist and confine us in the way that it does is bewildering to me. And so, for example, we're having a lot of issues in the UK right now because the UK so far are only allowing 50 refugees from the Ukraine. The UK is having a massive issue of like deporting a lot of um, a lot of immigrants and a lot of people who have formerly had status in this country. And so that's essentially like the work that I do, because I could have just as easily been deported, you know, and I I am, and I say this all the time, that even though I have nationality and a passport, I'm a refugee with a passport. That because a refugee is an experience that's born in you, like that can never really leave you.
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting how poetry can cross borders. You're also a poet. And as this is City Lights, I'm, of course, compelled to ask you kindly, would you read or recite one of your poems for us?
Absolutely, absolutely. So, as it is the 8th of March today, which, as I'm sure many of us are aware, also is International Women's Day, I thought I would read this poem, which I wrote essentially in dedication to the women of Congo, particularly those in Eastern Congo who are afflicted by the war, but also just thinking of women all over the world, really, in conflict situations, but also in situations of exploitation and disempowerment in so many situations that we often don't get to hear about. And so this poem is from my collection Refuge, and it is called She is a Poem. She is not a poet. She is a poem, writing herself into the hearts of everything she touches, but she wouldn't have you know it. Her story is untold. Like a flower that never unfolds to the sun, she has no option but to search for the light within herself. Her spirit is her wealth, the most precious natural resource. Of course, she holds a nation in her palm, calmed the cries of orphan babies and wiped away their tears in spite of all the suffering and the violence. After all of these years, she has vowed never to let go. So with hope, she keeps holding on. So you cannot speak to me of being strong until you have heard the laughter of a rape survivor caress your spine. It will paralyze your indifference. The sunset of her smile will stay forever in your mind until that day when you realize that you are much closer connected than you think. Because when on the brink of despair, everybody stares into the horizon, dreaming of a better day. If only she could write her own future. But she isn't a poet. She is a poem being written into your heart.
Wow, man, that's apropos and gorgeous, and very grateful for that. I think this would be a good time for us to kind of open up the room for questions. We already have a couple of kind of little comments trickling through. Let me see if I can get let's see. So Karen asks, she comments, I love the title. Could you tell us a bit more about it?
Yeah, thank you, Karen. So the title essentially is kind of a play on a few things. So firstly, that our life, to stay alive, we need to breathe, right? And that playing this idea of kind of suicide and suicidal ideation, that breathing is often considered an involuntary act, something that we have no control over doing. We just do it, and then one day we stop breathing, right? But I try to kind of like flip it in that, like, breathing is intentional. And essentially for someone, who may be experiencing what Michael, the protagonist, is experiencing, in that, he is having thoughts of not living, not wanting to live, that his living essentially and continuing to choose to breathe is a selfless act. And that is also a play on the idea that, unfortunately, a lot of the societal misconception is that someone who takes their own life is selfish. We still have those. And I feel like that is such like a completely kind of mistaken narrative. Like, it's so false and so wrong, because for people who are thinking or experiencing what Michael's experiencing, that every day they wake up and don't end their life, like, they are being selfless by still continuing to be here. They are thinking about other people all the time. Like, they're thinking about their loved ones. They're thinking about, like, their friends, their family, their mothers, their fathers, whoever they have connections with. because as much as the burden of existence, like, is absolutely slowly destroying them, they also feel in advance the pain that it would cause if they were no longer to be here. And so actually, like, I try to think about it in a way that the title is essentially a reflection of that, and that for people who are experiencing that, like, breathing is a selfless act. And so therefore the selfless act of breathing.
Beautiful. So let's see, I think we have Karen thanks you. It's beautiful, she says. And I think also Lotus really loves the title. If there are any other questions, please come on, drop them in the chat. Let's engage. I'm very curious to know, you've also been working as a playwright, trying to kind of, operate in that milieu as well. And could you talk a little bit about what that experience is like versus, just working on a novel? It's a very different thing.
So, yeah, I mean, I think, again, similarly, like, it's quite accidental. I wrote a play called Adidas Traxxas, and it's essentially a conversation between these two young men at the top of the roof of their estate, which is like their block, and they're just the same block that they grew up on, and they're essentially just having like a conversation, and the conversation spirals. And for me, I as much as I love novels, like, I absolutely love writing novels. But I love you, and for those of you who are going to read The Selfless Act of Breathing, you'll see that I love descriptions. But what plays do is it just strips away from all of that, and it makes you just go straight to the core. And essentially, like, that's what I'm kind of trying to do, without all the distractions of, the prose that kind of describes the leaves on the ground and the crunching of them and all of that. And I think plays are beautiful. One of my favorite plays, I'll mention a writer called Arenze Kenny, and he wrote a play called Misty. And that was supposed to, so pre-pandemic, that was supposed to show on Broadway in 2020, but unfortunately, pandemic kind of caused delays with that. So I don't know if it's still going to come over to America, but I would highly recommend that. It's one of the most beautiful plays I've ever seen in my life.
Wow. Karen has a question. I'd love to hear more about exposing young people to the real world and keeping alive. You've already talked about empowering youth to narrate their own lives. Is that an integral part of keeping hope alive?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's one of, for me, I think hope is one of the most radical things that we could do right now, and just always, ever. And, it's funny, I talk to my dad, and my dad is just a man who's just seen everything, right? Like, nothing phases him, having grown up, being born in Congo, essentially during colonialism, then lived through independence, then lived through a 32-year dictatorship, then civil uprisings and war, and then traveled around Europe. And like, he's just seen everything. And he is the most hopeful person that I know. Like, he's always talking about a future. He's always talking about tomorrow, what we can do, and so forth. And I think that, like, that just makes hope that radical force that we don't realize that it is, and that without it, like, hope is actually revolutionary. Like, that's the thing that transforms our lives, like hope and love. And without it, we essentially, like, can't do anything. And I think that, if we are all kind of continuing to buy into the vision of society that we all aspire to have one day, right? Of these values of egalitarianism and so forth, equality, etc. It's because we have hope. Otherwise, we would abandon what is a just cause. And so for me, in the poetry that I write, and the novels that I write, and everything that I write, and how I communicate with people, I try to find a balance of very much being kind of aware of what's going on in the world, but also of having hope. Like, we will go to sleep hoping to wake up tomorrow, and I think that for me anyway, I've been in places where I have not had hope, and I've really been indifferent to seeing tomorrow. And now it's like, well, I do have hope, and I think that that's just a powerful thing. So that's what I try to pass on. And I think that hope is something that it's the way that I see it, it's kind of like a flame, right? Imagine we're all candles, like you lighting another candle with a candle doesn't take away the light from the other candle. Like there's now two candles lit. So now that connection is two hopeful people. And so the more that we connect with each other, the more that we're able to pass on this energy.
That is such a beautiful metaphor. And I think maybe a good place for us to kind of come to a close here. But, thank you ever so much for this moment with you. And it's been such a great honor and a pleasure to meet you and have you with us here.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you everyone who gave up their time to be with us. You could have been doing anything, but you sat and listened to me for a little while. And Peter, thank you for hosting and making this very fun. It's it's given me hope, more hope as well. So yeah, thank you.